The central problem of developed countries today is we're taxing a lot, we're spending a lot, poor outcomes. We never create the NHS in the way it operates at the moment.
This is Tony Blair, one of the most impactful politicians in history.
Securing 3 consecutive terms.
Once among the world's most popular leaders,
he's now a powerhouse
in global business and advisory work.
I don't know what he's talking about. Why does he think this? I mean, he's been out of frontline politics for too long.
He now employs 800 people across 5 continents, advising 50 world leaders.
Okay.
He has some pretty punchy opinions, but he thinks that AI is one of the top issues that governments are ignoring.
Where would you place artificial intelligence in the top 3 of your priorities? The top, not in the top 3, the top. You really cannot afford to be spending the amount of money we're spending on mental health.
This is Tony Blair on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
That's a question I've never been asked before.
This episode is brought to you by Octopus Energy. More about them later on. Tony, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Thank you very much, Jimmy.
What is the job of a former Prime Minister?
And that's a question I've never been asked before, so you stumped me. I think it's whatever you decide you want to make it. But I think the strange thing is about politics is, especially when you're in government, is you're obviously, I sometimes say you start at your least capable and most popular, and you end often in politics at your least popular but most capable. I think one of the things that you do is learn over time how to do the job better, and therefore when you finish, it's strange if you don't make use of that experience. And I often reflect now when I'm seeing other former prime ministers I work with in my institute that they can talk to leaders in a language the leaders understand because they've done the job and they've been there. And you do learn a lot from doing it, and it's one of the very few walks of life in which people can both come into a senior position without really any experience of having done it before, and then leave it without people ever trying to learn from the experience they've then acquired.
Yeah. And why did you write the book? And who is the audience in mind that you have for it?
Well, the audience are people who are either in government or want to be in government. But in fact, I think the leadership skills are pretty much the same, whatever you're trying to do. So people who've read it and who are running companies or even just community organizations, they get a certain amount from just the lessons of leadership that you can apply across the piece. But I wrote it because over time, not just in the work I did when I was Prime Minister, and that's more than 10 year stint, so that's a long time to be doing it. But also, we work in roughly 45 countries now, so we've got relations with leaders all over the world. And what is interesting, and the reason in the end I decided to put it all down in writing, but try and put it in a simple form, is that you realize the lessons are the same in whatever, even though countries offer differ enormously at their stages of development and their potential, the actual lessons of leadership are pretty much the same.
There's a whole sort of industry around Masters of Business Administration. Why do you think that doesn't exist around government so much? Because this probably is the best instruction manual I've come across for government, and it's a book I wish I could have read pre-number 10 working in there. Why do you think that just doesn't exist as much?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the answer is because people regard government and politics as the same thing.
Yeah.
Whereas when you actually get into government, you realize there's politics and there's government, but the governing part of it is really about executive capability. The politics part of it is all about politics. I mean, it's so getting the right narrative, persuading people, going out and doing the glad handing, mounting the political campaign. When you're in government, it's very similar to running a company or an organization, except more complicated. Because you've got lots of different interests that obstruct change. But the actual process of leadership in terms of getting things done is, that's the hardest thing about government, getting anything done.
Yeah.
You know, I used to say to people, I'd sit in Downing Street at the beginning and think, look, I'm Prime Minister, I've got a huge majority in Parliament. I therefore am, in theory at least, the most powerful person in the country. So if I take a decision in that cabinet room, then presumably something happens. And after a time, you realise nothing happens. So you have to go back and then focus on implementation.
And how do you make sure that things do happen? I remember you talking on stage with William Hague as well at your conference, and you both having the same thing of, well, yeah, I'm one of the most important people in the country. I say something, therefore it should happen. But as you say there, it's not. What's the one thing that leaders can put in place to make sure their decisions are carried out by the system?
Well, I came to the view, and this is why we changed the way that government operated at the centre in my second term, that you need an actual implementation focus. So we called it a delivery unit, but you can call it whatever you like, which take your key priorities and just track their implementation, so that all the time you're getting feedback as to what you said would happen, what is happening, and what needs to bridge the gap between the two.
Yeah. You have become a big proponent of technology and the power of technology when it comes to government, and this podcast is all about jobs of the future. You've written a report recently on the impact of AI on employment over the next 20 or 25 years. Firstly, how would you define AI? Because in the book you talk about it being sort of one of the most overused and widely used phrases at the moment. How would Tony Blair define AI?
Well, I mean, AI has got many different forms in a way, but essentially what it is the ability to accumulate large amounts of data and to make sense of that data. That's the basic artificial intelligence. But now with generative AI, you can actually take that data and predict what would be the sensible outcome of all that data that you have, so that you start to be able to write briefings and shorten all the process that goes into, particularly that goes into government. And finally, you will get a stage of artificial general intelligence when you will be able to, with all of that data, and remember the vast amount of data that we use has been created in the last decade, you will be able, for the machine, as it were, to think for itself and therefore to help devise policy. So you're going to be able to, it is a transformative thing. And, one of the things that's most challenging about politics is that people live in their own political history and they find it very hard when something as new as this comes, because this is a revolution, right? And I always say this is the 21st century equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. People find this in politics. I'm constantly having conversations with politicians saying this is the single biggest thing. Yeah. So the report that you've just mentioned on what is the employment impact of AI, I mean, it's going to be enormous, right? So it should be the thing that occupies government really as its central mission. Yeah. Because it can also change the way you do healthcare, the way you do education, the way you do crime fighting, the way you do government. And it's going to transform the private sector. Now, if you sit, as I did just a couple of weeks ago, with a whole range of top CEOs from around the world, and I was at a conference, and I said to them, where would you place artificial intelligence in the top 3 of your priorities? And virtually all of them said the top. Yeah. Not in the top 3, the top. Right. So if you've got and this was a broad range of private sector organizations, not just financial companies, but retail sector, tourism. If you've got them all saying that, it's a strange thing if you're going into government and it's kind of something amongst all the other things.
Yeah. But why is it that governments aren't taking it as seriously? Because I think, as well, one of the things that's different about the AI revolution compared to the Industrial Revolution is that you could be just 3 or 4 electoral cycles away from this, sort of completely changing the economy, right? That is an incredibly quick change when you look at the grand sweep of history, etc. So why are governments not taking it more seriously?
Well, they do in a look. The conversation I used to have with politicians 3 or 4 years ago were really almost like, I don't know what he's talking about. Why does he think this? I mean, he's been out of frontline politics for too long. Okay, so that was conversation then. Now it is, I get it. It's a really big thing. But you still have that. They struggle, I think, with how do you turn it into a political narrative.
Yeah.
So a lot of people say to me, but when we do focus groups, they talk about technology, they kind of, they look at you a bit blankly, or they're actually frightened by it. And I say to them that the first job of the politician is to work out what they really believe is happening in the real world and what the country needs in order to succeed. And the next stage is to work out how you turn it into a political narrative. But you can't, because something's difficult to define in political terms, or because, for example, which it doesn't really fit into right and left.
Yeah.
Right. In those circumstances, your job as a politician is to find the way of translating that into a political narrative, not to say, well, it's too difficult, so I'll talk about something else, because it is the big real world change. Yeah. So if you take the central problem of developed countries today is we're taxing a lot, we're spending a lot, poor outcomes. Yeah. Technology is the answer to that, for sure. It is the thing that can transform your healthcare system and go right across public services and change it and produce huge savings. So you're producing better public services at lower costs. That's the challenge of the developed world. The challenge of the developing world is how do they accelerate development? Do they have to go and build the legacy systems of the West and developed nations in order to succeed? The answer is no, they don't today. Yeah. They can use... We'd never create the NHS in the way it operates at the moment if we had these technological tools available when the NHS was created. So this is why if we're in the serious business of politics, which is about affecting change for people, not just engage in politics in inverted commas, you've got to take this revolution seriously. It is the mission of the government, should be, of any government in the modern world.
One of the things that citizens are most worried about, as you point out there, is the potential for job losses and so on. And basically you have these 4 different sort of scenarios that you talk about in terms of breeze, tailwind, jet stream and whirlwind. And it's really interesting the way it's kind of all broken down so on. But essentially it looks that in the sort of breeze case scenario, it's 1 million jobs displaced over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, right up to 3 million. Now, I wondered if you were being almost a bit too optimistic on that, because when we did some polling, 1 in 3 people thought that AI could be doing their jobs by 2028. And I just thought, gosh, that is a marked sign of how people are actually thinking about this. Now, obviously, jobs evolve, and we're not going to talk about 10 million people there being displaced completely, but are people right to be worried about AI and how it will impact their jobs?
Well, it will definitely impact their jobs. I mean, I think of the 4 scenarios, we in the end think the tailwind one, which is a relatively steady accumulation of change, is the most likely one. But I honestly think you can't really tell. It depends what happens once people see the benefits of it. And, because I study a lot what's happening with technology startups and so on, it's interesting, for example, in the legal profession, you're getting a lot of startups now that are providing legal services through AI with vastly reduced workforce. So I do think you will automate a lot of processes, but I think in many cases, and this is the other thing that's hard to judge at this moment, in many cases, AI will become a co-worker and not necessarily a displacer of your job. So I think for doctors, for example, and nurses and indeed teachers, AI will become a help and an aid to them. It won't necessarily put them out of a job, because most people will say, okay, so AI can give you basic diagnosis and give you lots of information. It can, you're able as a doctor to have at your fingertips all of medical science, but most people will still want a human mind, at this stage at least, to make the final decision. So in those circumstances, it becomes a way of increasing your productivity without necessarily displacing the job. But in other cases, I think it will displace jobs. But our basic experience with technology over the years is that some jobs get displaced and others get created.
Completely. Although you did say something there which would be remarkably difficult for an existing politician to say, which is, you said, I don't know. And I think that is part of the problem that we have in politics and government at the moment, is that everything tends to be black or white, particularly on the campaigning side. And truth be told, is we don't know the impact that this is going to have.
Yeah, we don't fully. But that one of the advantages of being outside frontline politics is you're able to say, I don't know the answer to that.
I'm proud this episode of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future is brought to you by Octopus Energy. I regularly recommend Octopus Energy to friends because the customer service is so good. But that is not what I am actually here to talk to you about today. They have just partnered with the King's Trust to launch Jobs That Matter. Are you wondering what's next? What comes after school or after university? Jobs That Matter is a careers hub supported by Octopus Energy and the King's Trust. It is designed to help young people find well-paid, in-demand, impactful jobs right here in the UK. Whether you're into tech, renewable energy, or making a difference in your local community, Jobs That Matter connects you to opportunities that empower you to build a future that you're proud of. So if you're ready for what comes next, head to jobsthatmatter.uk.
One of the things that we do know, though, in the UK is that we've got close to 1 million more people not in work now than pre the pandemic, which is a remarkable statistic. And we seem to be struggling a lot more than other countries with this. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure is the honest answer, but it is a massive problem. I think that there may be some aspects of long COVID, but then that shouldn't affect us more than it affects any other country. I think we have become very, very focused on mental health, and with people self-diagnosing on mental health, and I think we need a proper public conversation about that because, I think it's a very, very difficult question. We're spending vastly more on mental health now than we did a few years ago, and it's hard to see what the objective reasons for that are. And if we're not careful, we get into a position where people, life has its ups and downs, and everybody experiences those. And you've got to be careful of encouraging people to think they've got some sort of condition other than, simply confronting the challenges of life. And so we need a proper public conversation about this, because you really cannot afford to be spending the amount of money we're spending on mental health, and the ramp up of that just in these last few years has been dramatic.
Do you think we need some sort of review or commission in regards to that?
Well, I think we need, and this again, technology can help with this. It can help, by the way. There's some really interesting innovations happening in different parts of the world on how technology can help with mental health issues and problems that people have. But we need also to be helping people to understand that there are in life there are going to be problems, right?
Yeah.
Now, you've got to be careful of translating those into a mental health condition rather than and losing your own agency in a way to govern your own life. So I think it's very, very difficult, but it's a conversation we need to have. And like so much of the problems that we have today, they don't really fit into party lines. And I think the more that you can try and resolve some of these without putting them into that arena of political debate, partisan political debate, the better.
Yeah. In terms of how government can learn from technology and technology innovators, you talk about in the book Elon Musk and how he is a sort of one extraordinary innovator, and how he's almost re-engineered every aspect of cars, technology, and also space travel, etc. What do you make of his appointment by President Trump to the American government?
Well, I think it's very interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. But you see, everything that we're talking about here at the Institute, because we have this whole program called the Reimagined State, is all about how you use technology to create a state that's probably significantly smaller but much more strategic. And that's, I think, where things are going, where the citizen is more empowered in its in his or her relationship with the state. And you don't have a situation where you think that every problem is just going to be solved by increasing the power of the state. So, we'll see what happens with the DOGE, I think they're calling it. But they're putting their finger on what I think is the challenge of modern government, which is how do you make it work more effectively, and how do you use technology to make it work more effectively at a lower cost? And look, I come across this the whole time. I mean, I've just been having a conversation earlier today with people trying to do business in Africa and seeking the help of Western agencies in allowing them to go and invest in Africa, because you've got all sorts of political risks you've got to take account of, and just describing the nightmare of bureaucracy they get into.
Yeah.
And then you have this conversation with Western diplomats and politicians where they say, why is China doing so well in Africa and we're not? And I say to them, because we are hopelessly bureaucratic. And if anyone wants to get anything done, they go to the Chinese, something happens. Yeah. They go to us, and 3 years later, nothing's happened. So this is part of a bigger conversation that, again, I think, especially if you're from my side of politics, right, the progressive side that has tended always to favor the state as an answer, you've got to realize that the mood today in the Western world is one which is aligned to disruption. That exactly the same disruption that technology is creating in the private sector is disruption people want to see in the way the state operates. And if you're simply operating a status quo state, you're going to find yourself in trouble.
What is your advice to business leaders going into government?
Well, we can use Elon Musk, or we can talk to other people, but it's something you talk about quite a bit.
I mean, look, I personally think we should be getting a lot more business skill and capability into government, and I think we've really got to get over this notion that somehow business people come into government because they've got some profit motive of their own. Most of these business people are going to come into government because they genuinely want to help the country and use their skills to do it, and we should be welcoming them. But I mean, I had this experience when I brought business people into government. I'm afraid they just get beaten up from day one. So my advice to business people going into government is, first of all, understand, if you think it's going to be an easy ride, it's not. But they do have a skill set that's really important. Yeah. And there's one of the things I talk about in the book is you've really got to understand today that in a world of rapid change, your traditional bureaucracy are not going to be the innovators. You're going to have to bring the innovators in from outside, because it's not the way they work. Any system, any bureaucratic system in government is risk averse.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole point about innovation is taking risk. And what people, and I'm afraid this is it's not a British issue, it's anywhere you go. The problem is that if you're in the civil service and the bureaucracy, you can get punished for taking a risk, but you'll never get punished for not taking a risk.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. And it probably always will be like that. So if you're looking for that engine of innovation, you're going to have to look outside.
Yeah. What advice would you give for leaders trying to understand technology and the progress of change? Because, for example, I think of Keir Starmer now, probably going to be Prime Minister for another 4 years at least. Like, technology is going to change a lot in that 4 years. And how can he kind of stay up to date with what's kind of happening? How can he find the time to do that?
Well, you've got to, first of all, bring the capability into government. You've got to have people who are going to advise you, who are doing it. But, we've got some great technology companies and leaders in technology in this country, all of whom would be very happy to help. You've got Matt Clifford, who's advising the government at the moment, who's absolutely excellent, who's both done it and there's a lot of knowledge about it. So we've got in DeepMind, we've got probably one of the finest, if not the finest, artificial intelligence company in the world. So there's masses of stuff we can do. The important thing with politics, and this is not just in relation to AI, but more generally, is one of the hardest things for leaders to find the time to think strategically whilst they're dealing with the day-to-day. But you really do have to do that, especially in a fast-changing world. And one of the things I say to leaders today is that often there are technical areas in which the leader doesn't really need to know anything about the technicalities. They just need to know what the political decision or executive decision is. But in this area, I think you do need a certain amount of knowledge. And I've spent a lot of time over these last few years because technologies, I've understood its importance, but never tried to really understand the detail. But I have tried to do that in these last years. And I wrote a chapter in the book about it, which is, people can sort of mock us as a ChatGPT version of artificial intelligence. But, I really tried to go back and understand how we're now in a permanent revolution of technological change. And I do think it's necessary for leaders to have at least some basic knowledge today.
And how did you do that learning? Like, how did you go about it? Because I think it's really interesting. I mean, you say in the book as well, I've been surprised, shocked, and more than occasionally appalled at how much I've learned since leaving office.
Yeah, it's true. It's a terrifying thing.
But how have you learned about it? Because I did find that the sort of history of AI and technology really interesting.
It is really interesting.
Yeah, but I thought, it's in a way you could get ChatGPT to churn that out for you, but actually you've got to understand it, right? And I think this is sort of the next level of education and learning that we perhaps don't understand yet.
Yeah, so I spent an entire holiday, much to the irritation of my family, just poring over all of the... I literally went back to the telephone, and Alexander Bell and all the rest of it, and how it all began, and then how, the first transistors were created, and then you realize and how computers developed, and then you get to this point where you start to understand that once you've got the mobile phone and the internet and the two are joined up, then you're creating this vast amount of data. And then you realize that the more data you create, then the better your artificial intelligence becomes. And then, of course, you get to the stage now where you've got these large language models where you're just training them on vast amounts of data. And what will happen with all of that is they'll create more data. So you'll have even more potential. And that sort of the nature of this data revolution and the consequences of it and the ability ultimately to get to, as I say, artificial general intelligence, which we're not at yet, but most people believe we will arrive at. I mean, once you understand that, then, a lot of what you deal with in government becomes secondary to what the implications of that are for the way you govern.
Another area that Britain leads the world in is FinTech. The applications, innovation and global footprint we have in the fourth industrial revolution gives us a great opportunity for growth. The FinTech Alliance acts as a digital bridge between FinTech ecosystems in countries across the globe. FinTech has been the beachhead for connected commerce, and we should celebrate the UK's great advantages in light touch regulation, rule of law, common business language, and strong diplomacy. Find out more at fintech-alliance.com.
What have you used ChatGPT for?
Well, I've used it for just basic things like giving me information about, particular subjects. But I did a really interesting thing the other day. So I was at some conference. I won't say which conference, and I won't say listening to the speech of which president, but I was listening to the speech of a president about his country and what it was doing in relation to renewable energy. And I thought, well, this is a really boring speech. And what's more, he's not really telling me very much at all. So I went off and put put it through ChatGPT, name a country, what they were doing on renewable energy. I got a speech the same length, much more interesting, much better, much more informative than the one he'd given. So, you realize, it's ChatGPT at the moment is a toy, but it will ultimately develop into something much, much more powerful. And already you're going to find government's all about process. This is what I say to people in government. If you're in the private sector, AI is obviously important and it can improve productivity. It's probably the only answer to the productivity puzzle. But government's all about process. So think how much you could change. Think how much of our planning system is tied up in analysis of masses and masses of detail and the application of certain rules to it, which take months and months, hold everything up, hold the economy back.
And it could make all that so much quicker.
Yeah.
There's also another line that really struck me in the book, which to you may have been a bit of a throwaway line, but really hit home with me. You say, I've tried to build and develop businesses and not simply just think about regulating them. It's a lot tougher than I thought. How has it been tougher building a business than you thought?
Because in government, you just get this structure given to you. So you use the structure. But then when you're building a business, you've got the hiring of all the people.
Yeah.
You've got, as you grow, we're now a large organization. You get legal, you get compliance, you get, you have to try and prevent yourself becoming bureaucratic. You're constantly evolving because you realize some things work and some things don't. So you have to be able to adjust. And, government can often be a problem rather than a solution.
On that in mind, is it a problem at the moment that none on the Labour front bench have built a business or really been involved in the private sector?
Well, I was a private sector lawyer, but I never built a business. But you can learn a lot from talking to people, but you've got to come with the attitude, I think, that business is part of the solution and not just a problem. And by the way, one other thing that's important to emphasize, because whenever I talk about AI and technology, people kind of say he's going messianic on it. But I completely agree there are all sorts of problems that are going to come with this technology revolution. Huge challenges. The bad actors can use artificial intelligence as well as the good actors. And in some cases, for example, in organized crime, they're doing it much better at the moment than law enforcement agencies. So I've got absolutely no doubt there are going to be massive problems. It's not a question of whether, I debate this often with leaders. They say, well, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And I say to them, well, first of all, you've got to understand it's a thing. Whether it's good or bad, you can debate, but it's happening. Yeah.
But do you wish that you'd had more private sector experience when you were Prime Minister?
Yeah, absolutely. And the private sector experience I did get was I was a lawyer in the commercial and industrial sphere. So I was actually interacting a lot with companies, and I did learn a lot from that.
Yeah.
It was only for 7 years, but I did doing employment cases for and against employers, for example, or doing commercial and business cases. I did learn a lot. But for sure, and my advice to anyone going into politics today is spend some time in the private sector first.
When you're hiring, what skills are you looking for? Or characteristics?
Yeah, that's a good question. Capability, obviously, and talent, real commitment, being a team player. The capability you look for is always the capability, again, to get something done. Those are the... But it's important also that people are prepared to be in a team. I was very lucky in Downing Street. I had a really, really good team. And I used to say to them all the time, we're there for each other, and we should be pleased if the other person's doing well, and if someone gets into a problem, you're with them and you're backing them, right? You're not throwing them under the bus because it's the convenient thing to do. And I think you have to kind of instill that culture. But yeah, no, what you look for are the obvious things around talent and ability, but also this understanding that you've got to be, you're part of a team of people, and you've got to look out for each other.
Does it vary what skills and characteristics you're looking for between the public sector and private sector?
Well, I don't think it should, but probably it often does. And one of the things I say about the Institute, because we're a not-for-profit, and I don't personally take a salary out of the Institute, but I say to people, whenever they're joining and I'm talking to them, let's be clear, we are not a government department, we're not an NGO, and we're not a charity. And I don't want that culture in the organisation, which is not to say we don't have strong ideals, and what we're doing is hopefully good work for people, but I want the spirit of enterprise to run through what we do.
Yeah.
And that can be challenging sometimes because people think if it's a not-for-profit, then but there shouldn't be anything slack about it.
What other British businesses do you admire? You mentioned a couple earlier, but just that you spend a lot of time now working with them and so on, like which AI companies?
Yeah. I don't think I'd single any out particularly. I mean, we've got partnerships with various companies, but I'm always looking for the leadership to have a clear sense of direction and a clear understanding of what they're trying to achieve, because those are the companies that do well. This is why the skills of leadership are the same in any organisation. It's the same if you're leading a government. You've got to have a clear strategic objective and direction, and you've got to be, I described the 4 Ps. You've got to prioritise, you've got to get the policy right, you've got to get the people right, and you've got to performance manage the result.
When I boil what this podcast is down to use another P, it's a lot about trying to raise people's ambitions and trying to get them to kind of increase their capabilities and find a job that they can really have impact with. You talk about the ambition hardening when your mother passed away just after your university finals. What else do you think led to such ambitious traits in Tony Blair?
My father was himself very ambitious and had come from a very poor background, and then had suffered a severe stroke when I was 10. So, I was always aware of the fragility, but I'm not quite sure whether it comes from something innate, kind of genetic, or it's just where you. I think where you decide you want to make a mark and where you get enthusiastic about things. I'm not sure that. I think the most important thing is to find something you're passionate about. Because if you are, by the way, it stops being a job and becomes something you actually enjoy. And there's always a difference between a job and a vocation. So if you can find that thing that really makes you excited, that's the best thing for ambition. And any of the people I've ever met who have been highly successful have always been very, very disciplined, but always because they're enthusiastic about what they're doing.
You don't just have to be a listener to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. I often go into companies to give talks and workshops on the future of jobs, of work, and of course, how AI will impact all of this. If you want to know more about the topics that I can speak on, just visit our podcast website at www.jobsofthefuture.co. Yes, it is just .co. I joke, it's because we couldn't afford the M when we started out. That's www.jobsofthefuture.co.
What advice would you give to, when you left office, you were a pretty rarity as a former Prime Minister. Now, we've got quite a few more of them. And actually, there's quite a lot of working decades left amongst them. What advice would you give to them in terms of trying to work out how to utilise the office of the former Prime Minister as best as they can?
Well, I think the simplest thing is, because you've been Prime Minister of what is still a significant country, that gives you a platform from which you can go and do other things. But you should do something that, again, is going to interest you. And if you've become Prime Minister of a country like Britain, you'll have had a certain amount of ambition and drive to get there. I mean, it's not a job that happens by accident, or occasionally it does, but very occasionally. And so, and there's nothing, people should understand. I mean, of course, you want to get a certain income and so on, and you can go on the speaking circuit and do all of that. But it's also finding something that keeps you genuinely interested and motivated. Because if you are someone of strong motivation, you don't want that suddenly to cease, particularly when, as you say, you might have people out of after power but still active for 20, 30 years or more.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak's case, it could be 40.
Yeah, exactly.
We've just got a few quick fires to finish with. There's a slight reticence, perhaps reticence is the wrong word, a slight reluctance in the book that you never got an apprenticeship before being Prime Minister. If there was one other cabinet job that you could have done before, which one would you choose?
Well, apart from the obvious one, which is Treasury, I think education.
I thought you might say that. You're 71. You've still got another 10 years left. Are there any other jobs that sort of...
Okay.
Well, at least
that's a bit definitive.
But are there any other jobs that you would fancy? Sorting out the Middle East, NATO?
Well, I'm still active in that, though it's pretty unproductive. But no, I think I think one thing I would say is that once you've been Prime Minister, if you're going to do another job, it's got to be another big job that's worth giving everything else up for. But I've got a job which is building this institute, and it's a significant organisation now, but we can do much more and become much larger.
Okay. You have, of course, the best job in the world now, which is being a grandpa. What do the grandkids call you?
They call me Grandpa, and there was a time when this would have been severely upsetting, because it's I don't think of myself like a grandfather, but I'm afraid that's the way it is. So that's what they call me. But it's the one thing when people say it's the greatest thing. It's the one thing. What they say is actually true. It is fantastic. Yeah.
It's one thing that lives up to expectations. What was the first ever thing you did for money?
For money,
First job, almost.
First job, I think, was working on a building site.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
What was your job on the building site?
Carrying the bricks and helping to stay out of trouble. And then I worked in a bar. I think I worked in a bar for a time. Yeah. And then I did actually a few months in Paris as a barman.
Yeah? How was that?
Interesting. That was great fun, actually. It was great fun and good experience. And yeah.
Final question. Would you still study law today as an undergrad?
No, I don't think so. I mean, law is a really interesting subject to practice, and I did enjoy being a lawyer, practicing lawyer. And so I suppose you'd have had to have studied it in order to practice. But no, I think in retrospect, I would have probably studied history. If my results had been better, I might have studied science.
What would you study today if you were going, if you could?
If I was today and back at school again, I'd pay a lot more attention to my science lessons than I did at the time.
Brilliant. Tony Blair, thank you very much for coming on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.
If you watched this far, you might be interested to know a bit more about how we put an episode like this together, how the show started out 4 years ago, and yes, how we actually make money on YouTube. First up, the hours that go into creating an episode like this are intense. As soon as Tony got in touch saying he wanted to do the show and we got the date for a recording, the research starts. And whilst we have had research in the past, it is something that I feel that I really have to do myself. Partly because I enjoy it, but also because there is the occasional throwaway line in a book or a recent speech, and you think that is actually something I want to go deep on. Like the question that I asked him about how tough he's found it building a business. In total, I probably spent about 40 hours reading Tony Blair's books, speeches and previous interviews, including listening to a 30-year-old Desert Island Discs interview on a run round a park. When you think about it, Tony Blair is probably the most interviewed Briton alive. Arguably, when you think of the advent of modern media, he is possibly the most interviewed Briton to have ever lived. Therefore, it's a bit of a challenge to think, how do I get a new angle here? How can I ask him something that he's not been asked before? A challenge when interviewing politicians is that they are often in combat-ready mode. When I worked in Number 10 for Conservative Prime Ministers, we used to call it net practice. Essentially, we would think of the hardest questions to ask, and then we would fire them at the PM. A bit like exams, we would hope that the mocks would be tougher than the actual event. It was a bit surreal at times being as rude to your boss as you could possibly be. Part of the interesting thing about the podcast revolution is it has opened up so much more white space to discuss things on. Now, whilst politicians may be aware of that on a conscious level, as it's such a new medium, how do you make them realise it on a subconscious level? One of the maxims we have at Jimmy's Jobs of the Future is asking clever people simple questions can often bring about the most interesting answers. For example, when Tony Blair was talking about mental health and how we need to be careful about how much money we are spending on it, I think he went much further than he may have done in a traditional BBC interview. As part of my research, I did watch Amal Rajan of the BBC's interview with him, and I did have a wry smile on my face as I saw the closing credits and how many people were involved in it. It was close to 30 people. We had just 4 on this show. And at times, I think that's excessive, particularly when I think about how we started out 4 years ago and it was just with a £40 Amazon mic recording in my spare bedroom. The equipment we now use is 100 times that, and we now have millions of people engaging with our content each month. But the core missions of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future remain exactly the same as they were 4 years ago. Showcase the future of our economy, promote those creating jobs, and make careers advice relatable and entertaining. Fundamentally, I believe there has never been a better time to be building or switching careers. There are more exciting jobs than there have ever been before. However, the paradox is that sometimes that makes it harder to navigate, and that can actually lead to less social mobility than there's been before. 4 years ago, when this podcast started as a bit of a pandemic project, whilst I was figuring out what to do post Downing Street and looking after our new baby daughter, I couldn't have quite envisaged that 4 years later I'd be sitting down with Tony Blair to talk about what he thinks of the economy of the future. It does mean, though, there are a lot more costs now involved with producing this podcast. I've talked about the equipment that we use and the team that we bring. And it's the most common question I'm asked is, as a podcaster, how do you actually make money? And I think, seeing as I talk about the economy of the future and jobs of the future, I should be open and transparent about this. We basically have 4 revenue streams. As you will have seen, some of it comes from direct ad reads and sponsors, which accounts for around 10% of our revenue. And the generic YouTube ads that you see at the beginning only make up around 2%. The Jimmy's Jobs partnership episodes that we've completed with the likes of Scotch Whisky Association and Amazon makes up about 1/3 of our revenue. Last year, we spun out a production company, Boxlight, where we produce business podcasts and video content. And that also makes up around 1/3 of our revenue now. And the rest of it comes from me going and publicly speaking at events on AI, on jobs and workforce of the future. I think as an older YouTuber, it's important to be open about how money gets generated on these platforms. Thanks for sticking around and watching the whole show. Please like and subscribe and make a comment. It makes a big difference. Particularly, we're interested in who do you think would make a good guest? Who's had an inspiring career story? Who's made an unexpected change? Please leave a note in the comments below and we'll possibly get them on the show later in the year.